Chapter 2: Growing Up in Barbados. In 1936, Barbados was not the place it is today. The island was relatively primitive, undeveloped and insulated from the outside world. 93% of the population was black, and although the basic language was English, they had their own Bajan dialect, which was difficult even for an English-speaking person to understand. My father didn't speak English, let alone understand the Bajan dialect. He had no money, he had just arrived in Bridgetown, and I doubt that he had ever seen a black person before. Moreover, he had to make a living. In fact, he had to make an entirely new life for himself. When I think of my father at the age 25, I often mistakenly compare him to myself at the same age. But by comparison, he had lived 100 years to my 25, and his experience with life was even 100 times greater. Like those who came before him, my father became a peddler. He was desperate to get my mother and me out of Holland as soon as possible, and it was very important that he book passage for us before I was 2 years old, for the simple reason that if we traveled before my second birthday, he would not have to pay a fare for me. Fortunately for us, the few Jewish men in Barbados at the time helped him to finance our passage. And so my mother and I arrived in Bridgetown, Barbados in the spring of 1937, just before my second birthday. Thinking back to my father being a peddler and what he had to do in order to survive, I still find it hard to reconcile what he did with the person I knew. My dad was not particularly strong. He always had 2 left hands, and he was not at all mechanically inclined. As far back as I can remember, he couldn't easily balance himself on a bicycle. Yet he had a big heavy bike with a heavy metal carrier attached to the front, in which he carried a suitcase filled with assorted items for sale. Barbados is very hilly, and I can't for the life of me figure out how he managed to pedal that bicycle all over the island. But for a number of years he somehow managed to do that. It was a very hard way to make a living. After a few years, my father stopped peddling and opened a small dry goods store on Swan Street in Bridgetown. For the rest of the time he spent on the island, he was able to make a modest living from that store. About a year after my mother and I arrived in Bridgetown, my brother Alex, 3 years my junior, was born. My sister Betty was born the following year, and my younger sister Ellen was born 8 years later. While we were growing up, my mother's influence was almost inconsequential in our lives. I think the fact that her mother had died when she was very young and that she was sent away from home at an early age had a profound effect on her. She never knew a parent's love, she was never nurtured, and she received no education. She had no role models, so she never had the opportunity to develop any of the feelings and skills a woman needs to become a nurturing and supportive mother. Where she was most comfortable and most effective was in the family business. My father relied heavily on her. He was the brains behind the business, but my mother managed the store. It was my father who exerted virtually all the influence in the family, and we received most of our nurturing and support from him. But like my mother, he was not very demonstrative. He was also very guarded with his affection. To add to this, neither of my parents was about showing sympathy, and they were not receptive to our saying, "I'm tired" or "I don't feel well." Our parents didn't permit those feelings for themselves, so they didn't allow them for their children. They considered showing affection, being tired, or not feeling well to be signs of weakness. I'm not suggesting that we thought they didn't love us. We knew they loved us and that they would take care of us, but having said that, there was very little show of sympathy. Perhaps one of my early experiences will put this into perspective. When I was 12, I had a very painful toothache. After I had suffered with it for a few days, my mother took me into town with her, when she went to open the store, and she sent me across the street to the dentist. He decided to pull the tooth, and after filling me with what seemed like 50 shots of Novocaine, he did just that. I didn't know it at the time, but I have a tendency to bleed when I have dental work done that affects the gums, so the hole in my jaw would not stop bleeding. I went back to the store, dizzy from the Novocaine and bleeding all the way. My mother didn't exactly ignore me, but she didn't pay much attention to me either. She was busy. I was in mild shock from the experience, and my head was spinning so that I could hardly keep it up. My mother told me to go and lie down in the show window with a bolt of cloth under my head and to stay there until I felt better. Meanwhile, she continued to look after business in the store. I lay in the show window with people walking by and looking at me in my misery. Eventually, she told me to catch a bus and go home. I had to walk about a half a mile to the bus station. I was feeling very ill. When I got on the bus, I sat next to a large black lady. I put my head on her shoulder and fell asleep. I eventually got home and went to bed. Even though it was a very painful experience and it took a long time for my jaw to heal, no one ever acknowledged my condition. Interestingly, at the time, I didn't see that as being anything out of the ordinary. We were expected to be strong and not to complain and feel sorry for ourselves. That was just the way it was. We had a wonderful life in Barbados. Because I had nothing to compare it with, I probably did not appreciate it enough. Other than when I was in school, I lived as a beach boy, wearing only bathing suits and shorts, no shoes, and enjoying the wonderful climate and the sea. We were part of a small, tight, and caring Jewish community, and I had a solid Jewish upbringing. I had good friends, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and my life revolved mostly around sports, cricket, soccer, and water polo, as well as Sea Scouts and the Barbados Cadets. All in all, I was a true Bajan boy. Some segregation between blacks and whites was a fact of life in Barbados at the time. Still, I had both black and white friends, and I do not remember ever experiencing any anti-Semitism. In retrospect, I feel very privileged to have grown up in Barbados. Growing up there was an experience most young people today can only dream about. Culturally, we had a very rich Jewish life in Barbados, even though we were not very religious and were not kosher. It was impossible to be kosher because kosher foods were not available. However, we were very traditional. There were 25 Jewish families in our community, and we all lived in the same neighborhood close to each other. Most of the seniors had come from Europe and had similar traditional Jewish backgrounds. So everyone, young and old, kept the traditions and celebrated and enjoyed all of the Jewish holidays. Socially, the seniors kept to themselves. There was no assimilation with the non-Jewish community. But of course, all the children went to schools where they had non-Jewish friends. We were certainly not well off financially, so as children, we didn't have many luxuries or extras, but we never wanted for our basic needs. Most of our food was grown on the island, and it was not expensive. We did not need heating. We needed very little clothing, and we had an excellent school system. School days. We were taught under the British system, and we wrote the Oxford and Cambridge O-level exams in order to graduate from high school. As a youngster, I suffered from a serious lack of self-esteem. There were two reasons for this. First, I was not a good student. In fact, I was a very poor student. I even had the distinction of failing the same grade twice when I was 12 and 13 years old. I always sensed that something was wrong, but I did not know what it was. I figured I was just not very smart. Years later, I discovered that I had a learning disability that caused me to have great difficulty reading. When I looked at a page of small print or very tight writing, everything blurred and became a gray blob. So in order to internalize what I was reading, I had to concentrate very hard to see the words and read the same paragraph 2 or 3 times. It was hard, slow work. In those days, people were not sensitive to learning disabilities, and nobody seemed to suspect that I might have had a problem. A youngster with difficulties was just passed over, and that is what happened to me. Most of my teachers paid little attention to me and just wrote me off. I think they just decided I wasn't very bright, and I became known as a dunce. I had a close friend by the name of Harold Trahan. We went through most of high school together in the same classes. We used to sit next to each other in class, and it was difficult to tell which one of us was the poorer student. During class, the teacher would ask a question, then go around the room asking students by name if they knew the answer. When he got to us, he always said, "Oh, Konigsberg and Trahan, forget it, no chance." He never allowed that we might know the answer. Harold left school a year before I did, so he never finished high school. He went to work and we lost touch when I left the island the next year. I've taken the liberty of mentioning Harold and his school days here because as things turned out, Harold went on to become very successful, but I will get to that later. The second reason for my low self-esteem was my relationship with my father. In many respects, he was a very gifted man. He had a photographic memory and an amazing mind. He was mostly self-taught, but he was a scholar nonetheless. He was very learned in Jewish history and the Torah. He had a beautiful singing voice. He was a Kazan and was highly respected by his peers. In fact, he was one of the leaders of the Jewish community. But he also had his shortcomings. My dad did not understand the concept of empowerment, and he never looked for ways to make his children feel proud of themselves. He could always find reasons to put us down, especially me, his firstborn. Not that he did not have reason. It is interesting that the very things he complained about in his own father became his modus operandi with me. He often talked about how he never got a word of approval from his own father. He was also inept as a mentor and a teacher. When the time came for me to prepare for my bar mitzvah, my father was my teacher. His teaching method consisted of coming to the table with a strap, and every time I made a mistake, I got a whack. Unfortunately, my fluency in Hebrew was no greater than it was in English, so for me, instruction for my bar mitzvah was one whack after another. Somehow I managed to muddle through what I had to do and say for the ceremony, and I got it over with. For a European, especially a Jewish father, a good education was paramount. So given my lack of scholastic ability, it was clear to me that I was a disappointment to him. He believed I would never amount to anything, and he would often look at me, shake his head, and ask in Yiddish, "Whatever is going to become of you?" Given these dynamics, I grew up without confidence in myself. I felt inadequate, and I thought of myself as backward. Unfortunately, I could not shine in those areas that were closest to my father's heart, and I felt I had no other way to prove myself. There was, however, another side to my father. He could be very sensitive and kind. When I failed the same grade the second time, and I had to bring home my report card, I didn't know how I could possibly face him. I was scared out of my mind. Then he showed me his other side. Many of my friends had bicycles, and I wanted one too. I had been asking my dad for a bike for months, but he kept telling me he didn't have the money to buy me one. Anyhow, when I came home and showed him my report card, he looked at it, but he said nothing. I knew he was very upset, but still he didn't say anything. Nothing. That night, before I went to sleep, he came to me and said, "I want you to come downtown with me tomorrow morning." I went to sleep thinking that he had decided to take me out of school and that he was taking me downtown to look for a job. I was petrified, and it took me a long time to fall asleep. Next morning when we went downtown, Instead of looking for a job for me, he took me to a bicycle shop and bought me a bicycle. Not even once did he ever acknowledge my failure. He knew I was hurting enough. Although my father rarely displayed his affection, he had his way of letting me know he loved me. Having said that, I loved my father with all of my being, and there was nothing I wanted more than to please him and to make him proud of me. Today, I know that whatever I have achieved in this life was driven by my enormous desire to please my father and to gain his approval. And even though he passed away when I was 44, I continue to be driven by that same desire to win his approval. So I credit my dad and his unorthodox ways for all that I have accomplished, for giving me my drivenness, and for inspiring me to excel. I had a lucky break when I was 15. I was attending Harrison's College, an all-boys school, when the school authorities decided to put together a water polo team to compete in the Barbados Water Polo League. I had played some water polo when I was with the Sea Scouts, but I was not big or strong physically, and I was only a mediocre player. I was also very much afraid of getting hurt, but because I had played before, I was drafted onto the school team. 2 years before I finished school and left Barbados, the Barbados Water Police put a team together and joined the Island Water Polo League. One of their players was a policeman whose name was Lorenzo Best. He was a big, powerful man, about 6 feet 6 inches tall, with a great body and broad shoulders. He was also a very strong swimmer, and from the day he joined the league, water polo in Barbados changed. Before Best, water polo was a game where scores were measured in single digits, 3-2, 2-1, and sometimes 4-3. It was not a game in which high scores were registered. Best didn't have much finesse, but he was so strong and so fast he could bulldoze his way through anyone. If he got his hands on the ball, the goalkeeper had little chance of stopping it. From his very first game, Best consistently scored a lot of goals. He was unstoppable game after game. Eventually, our Harrison's College team came up against the Water Police team. Everyone on our team was around 16 years old, and we were all lightweights. Best played forward, and so did I, so we were on opposite ends. Within no time, he had scored 4 goals. It was humiliating, and my teammate, who was defending against him, said, "I don't want anything more to do with him." So we decided to take turns playing defense, and every time Best scored a goal, we'd change places. He soon scored 4 more goals, and it was my turn to mark him. He was playing forward, and I was now playing defense. Best terrified me. Although I was marking him, I was staying as far away from him as possible because I didn't want to get hurt. No one in the league other than Best could hold the ball in one hand. No one had hands big enough to manage that. Before Best, our game plan was to flip the ball, bouncing it and then flipping it in the direction we wanted it to go. We were fast, but Best, who could pick up the ball like a baseball, would grab it, wind up, bring his arm all the way back, and fire it at the net. Suddenly, while I was thinking I was far enough away from him to be out of his way, he brought his arm all the way back, and his hand, with the ball in it, was right in my face. So I just put up my hand and tapped the ball out of his. This happened once, twice, 3 times. What can I say? Best scored 8 goals in the first half, but in the second half, when I was playing defense against him, he didn't score a single goal against me. It was the first time anyone had ever held him scoreless. The next day, the headline on the sports page of the local newspaper read, "Königsberg holds Best scoreless." It was the first time my name ever appeared in a newspaper. As the season progressed, Best continued to score lots of goals in every game he played, except when he played against Harrison College. For whatever reason, I psyched him out, and for the next 2 years, he never scored a goal against me. My water polo career ended during my last month in Barbados. It so happened that Harrison's College and the Water Police were the finalists in the league that year, and the last game of the season was the final for the cup. At the time, water polo was played out in the ocean beside a pier which was packed with people who had come to watch the game. My father happened to be sitting next to the referee. Shortly before the game, Best came along the bridge yelling, "Where's Mr. Konigsberg?" The crowd made way for him, and when he was face to face with my father, he said, "If you let your son into the water today, I'm going to kill him." Now, Best was not a harmful or malicious person, so I'm sure he said that just for effect. But of course, the referee witnessed the entire spectacle. When the whistle blew, the team swam towards the center. Best always swam with his head down and his arms churning like a mixmaster. I was swimming towards him from the opposite end, but I got too close and his hand came down over me and caught me in the eye. I put on a terrific show. I sank to the bottom, then I came up, and then I went down again. The referee ordered Best out of the game. We went on to win the game and the cup. That was my last game for Harrison's College. It was not, however, my last encounter with Lorenzo Best. Because of Lorenzo Best, I had my first real taste of success, and that was the beginning of a long journey towards raising my self-esteem. In my last year at Harrison College, I had another important learning experience. Our sports day was a big event. In fact, it was the highlight of the school year. Many of the students from other schools on the island, both boys and girls, came to watch. Parents attended too. Since it was my final year at Harrison's College, I wanted to do something special. I wanted to leave some kind of mark that I had been there. Since I certainly wasn't going to leave my mark scholastically, I decided to try to qualify for the 400-meter race, which was an important event on sports day. So I bought a pair of running shoes and I started running. That was my training. I used to get up in the morning and run and run and run. I did that all year. When the time came to qualify for the running event, I won my heat in the 400 meters and qualified to run in the event on sports day. When the day came, there was a lot of excitement and big anticipation in the air. A lot of attention was focused on two big races, which were the last two events of the day. The 400-meter race was scheduled just before the 800-meter. My father made a special effort to attend because I was running. My girlfriend at the time was there too, and I wanted both of them to see me win my race. I mentioned earlier that I had been afraid of Best because he was big, but I neglected to say I was also intimidated because he was black. The truth is, I was intimidated because I knew, in fact, I think that most of us white guys knew, that black guys were much stronger and faster than white guys. I knew that as if it were really so. At the gun, I got off to a good start. After 200 meters, I was in the third place. With 100 meters to go, I was in second place. The runner in front of me was black, and without any thought, I just cruised in behind him with no effort at all, and I finished in second place. My teacher ran up to me when the race was over. I will never forget the expression on his face, and he shouted at me, "Konigsberg, what did you do? You didn't even try." I was absolutely stunned by what he said and the realization that because the guy in front of me was black, and given my absolute belief that black guys were stronger and faster, I had let him win. I hadn't even tried. That experience had a huge effect on me and has haunted me for the rest of my life. It was truly a life-altering experience, and I learned a very important lesson from it. I promised myself that I would never, ever again not give my best. That commitment became one of my prime motivators and is still with me today. I am sure that that race and the decision I made afterwards was another source of much of my drive and tenacity I have had over the years. Uncle John. After the war in Europe ended in 1945, my father made a special effort to track down one of his relatives, an uncle named Moishe Spurgel, who he believed was living somewhere in the United States or Canada. It took my dad several years to locate him, but he eventually found him living in Montreal under the name of John Spurgel. In 1951, my dad invited him to visit us in Barbados. I was 16 years old when my great-uncle John came to visit. One evening, we were sitting at the dinner table and my uncle asked my dad, "What are your plans for Max when he finishes high school?" My dad answered, "We're sending him to Israel." There was a war on in Israel at the time, so my Uncle John was surprised by my dad's answer. "Why are you sending him to Israel with a war going on there?" "The only thing Max can do is drive a truck," my father answered. "If he drives a truck in North America, he'll be a third-class citizen. But if he drives a truck in Israel, he'll be a first-class citizen because everyone in Israel is equal. That's why we're sending him to Israel." I knew that my father intended to send me to Israel when I finished school, but until that moment I had no idea why. For me, the message that the only thing he can do is drive a truck was another powerful blow to my already poor self-esteem. Once again, my father's remark underlined what he thought of me. My uncle suggested that my dad consider sending me to Montreal instead. He said that he had recently attended a graduation ceremony at McGill University in Montreal, and that one of the deans had made a speech in which he mentioned that there was a shortage of accountants in Canada. My father's response to that was, "So what? School is not for Max. He can't be an accountant." Anyway, as the evening went on, the two men continued talking and I went to bed. In the morning, I learned that my father had reconsidered his decision to send me to Israel and had decided instead to send me to Montreal to try to become an accountant. I don't believe he thought I would ever actually succeed in becoming an accountant, but I was finishing school and I had to move on, and for him, that was moving on. My guardian angel. Over the past years, I have come to believe that I have a guardian angel who watches over and takes care of me. This belief has a profound effect on how I view and live my life. For me, it is only by crediting my guardian angel that I can explain why, throughout my entire life, I have been directed or led or even forced to take a specific fork in the road, even though I could not see at the time that it was in my best interest to do so. Those forks have always turned out to be the right ones for me to take and have always led me in the direction I needed to go. Now, I'm not talking about divine guidance or spirituality. I simply believe that my guardian angel has always manipulated events and circumstances that have caused my life to change direction when a change was called for. Sometimes the circumstances seem unfavorable, even potentially disastrous, but whatever path I was forced to take, it always turned out to be exactly the path I needed to take. My belief is my guardian angel is very empowering and supportive, and has given me a great deal of confidence and strength. So when I'm forced to follow a particular path, I do not resist. The occasion of my uncle's visit and the resulting change in direction that my life took as a result was only one of the many events I am aware of where my guardian angel redirected me. In that instance, I did not choose that course. It was her intervention that guided me to Montreal instead of to Israel. Given the way my life has turned out, I am truly grateful. It was only later in life that I realized that my guardian angel has been looking out for me since I was a child, in fact, before I was even 2 years old. I mentioned earlier that I was born in Holland and that my mother and I joined my father in Barbados in 1937, just before my second birthday and the beginning of World War II. The war had little impact on me growing up on the island. It was only after I came to Canada that I learnt about Anne Frank in Holland and what had happened to her and her family. But even in the early 50s, when I first heard the Anne Frank story, it did not have much of an impact on me. Of course, it is a sad and frightening story, but I did not connect the coincidence of my coming from Holland and our being about the same age. Even years later, when I went to Holland and visited the house where she had lived, I was moved only as much as any other tourist might have been. The story of her life and death did not register with me, that as a Jewish child living in Holland at the time, I was potentially destined for the same fate. A few years ago, I watched a movie on television about a boy of about 12 who was living like a rat in Stalingrad during the siege of 1941. He lived in the sewers and underground, barely surviving. Somehow he makes contact with a German general and persuaded him that he believed in Germany and the idea of a super race, and that he wanted to be a part of it. Certainly, he didn't want to be part of an old, dying country like Russia. The general believed him, and as proof of his loyalty, got him to spy on the Russians. As it turned out, the boy was a double agent and was really spying for the Russians and feeding the Germans misinformation. It was heart-wrenching to watch that boy moving from one side of the city to the other through devastation and wreckage, with death all around him. The Germans eventually learnt that he was a Russian spy and killed him. That movie brought everything into focus and made me realize that I too could have ended up just as Anne Frank did, or as did the boy in the movie. But I was spared all that. I was there, but luckily my parents had had the foresight and courage to get us out just in time. It was 1937 when my mother and I left. In another 18 months, we would not have escaped. My dad saved us from almost certain death by getting us out of Holland at that crucial time. I regret that I never talked to my parents about any of this or thanked them for saving my life. I credit my guardian angel for manipulating the events and circumstances that caused my parents to make the decisions to leave Holland when they did. So I now know that my guardian angel has been with me since I was 2 years old, in fact, for all my life. As I continue my story, I will refer many times to my guardian angel and the ways she has redirected me. A new direction. Having made the decision to send me to Montreal to study accounting, my father recognized that the foundation of my early schooling was not strong and that I needed help if I was going to pass my final exams. I needed an O-level school certificate to be accepted at McGill University, and so he hired a tutor for me. My tutor was amazing. He worked with me on all my subjects, and he always found a way to explain things that I had never before been able to understand. His patience, encouragement, and skill as a teacher were the crucial elements that contributed to my successfully passing my O-levels. Considering the important contribution my tutor made to me, I am embarrassed to say that today I do not remember his name. However, I do know that he was at Harrison's College for only a short time, but that was the time I needed him. My teachers had long ago given up on me, and I certainly did not receive any support or encouragement from them. Chemistry was a case in point. On the morning of my final chemistry exam, I was sitting on the steps outside the building where I was to write the exam and looking through my textbook before the classroom opened. My chemistry teacher came along, and when he saw me with my head buried in the books, he laughed and called out to me, "Konigsberg, forget it. Don't even try. You can't do it." But I did do it. In fact, I came close to the top of the class in chemistry, and I did well enough overall to get into McGill. That is another example of my guardian angel at work. No one, including me, would have thought that with my academic history I would ever pass my O-level exams. And then, just when I needed it most, she delivered this particular tutor, a man able to get through to me in a way that no one had been able to do before. Although my guardian angel arranged to bring my Uncle John into our lives at such a crucial time for me, that deed would have been for nothing had I not been able to pass those exams. Social life, romance. There was one aspect of growing up in the Jewish community in Barbados that warrants telling. Socially, the entire Jewish community was very protective of its young people. By that, I mean there was no social intermingling of Jewish children with non-Jews, especially those of the opposite sex. Most of the community elders had lived in Europe before the war and had experienced extreme anti-Semitism. They had lived with both the experiences and the effects of the pogroms and the reality of the Holocaust during World War II, and were therefore wary of all non-Jews. So the very thought of intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews wasn't merely intolerable, it was heresy. Obviously, we Jewish youngsters associated with non-Jews in school and in sports, but that was as far as it was allowed to go. A Jewish boy or girl having a non-Jewish girlfriend or boyfriend was absolutely forbidden. A couple of years before I left the island, this consorting with non-Jews got me into big trouble. My father always knew that I socialized with girls, and although it concerned him from time to time, he generally turned a blind eye. However, when I was 16 years old, I became involved with a young Christian girl whose name was Fleur. She became my girlfriend, and our relationship continued for 2 years to the day when I left Barbados. With the connivance and support of my brother Alex and sister Betty, I managed to keep my relationship with Fleur a secret from my father for quite a while. However, when he finally found out that I was seeing the same girl all the time, all hell broke loose. I promised him I would stop seeing her and things calmed down, but I couldn't bring myself to break off the relationship. I kept promising him that I would, but I just couldn't do it, so I lied repeatedly. I used to tell him that I had broken up with Fleur, and when somebody would spot me with her, and within minutes it seemed, my father would receive a report and trouble would start all over again. In a nutshell, that was the nature of my relationship with my father for the last 2 years I was in Barbados, one blow-up after another. One of the reasons I broke my promise to my dad was that soon after I had made that promise, Fleur's father, who had been ill for some time, died and she was orphaned. She had lost her mother several years earlier. Under those circumstances, I just could not desert her. Fleur had lived with her father in one part of the island, but after he died she went to live with her older brother in another part of the island, and word soon got out that I had started up with another girl. My father tolerated my rumored new interest. He was relieved that my 1-year escapade was over, so things settled down for a while. However, a few months before I was to leave the island, he found out that my supposedly new girlfriend was actually the same girl, and all hell broke loose again. From then on, my relationship with my father was a disaster. He refused to talk to me, and the atmosphere for all of us at home became very strained. This continued even after I left the island. I remember the day I left Barbados like a scene from a Fellini movie. Scene 1, background. To begin with, my father is not talking to me. In fact, he hasn't been talking to me for many months. And now I'm leaving the island. Fleur and I had always known that when I finished high school, I would be leaving the island and that our relationship would end. Action. The day begins very early, before dawn. I get up and go over to say goodbye to Fleur. Meanwhile, my father wakes up, discovers that I am not in the house, and he goes berserk. I come home, keep in mind he hasn't spoken to me in months, and he starts to rant and rave, accusing me of being his final destruction and about 101 other things along the same line. On that note, we go to the airport. Scene 2. Action. In those days, when anybody left or arrived on the island, it was a big event. Everyone went to the airport. In my case, most of the Jewish community comes to see me off. My mother and father, Alex, Betty, and Ellen are all there. And Fleur is there too, standing over on the far side of the terminal building. She's within sight, but we're not communicating. Then somebody notices her and says to my father, "Look who's here." So my father looks over at Fleur and promptly passes out on the floor in the middle of the terminal building. Scene 3. Pandemonium. My father is lying on the floor, passed out, dead to the world. Everyone who isn't trying to revive him is in shock or is looking at me as if I had just shot him. My brother is speechless. My sisters are hysterical. Somebody is yelling, "Get a doctor." Suddenly, the boarding announcement for my flight blares out of the PA system, followed by silence, in the middle of which my mother looks straight at me and says in a clear, even voice that everyone can hear, "You will not be happy until you kill him." I turn slowly, walk out to the plane, and board it. I don't look back. Fade out. That was the scene I left behind and the burden I carried with me when I left Barbados to start my new life in Canada. I thought the Fellini movie was over, but it wasn't. Not quite yet. One of the first things I did when I arrived in Montreal was to sit down and write a letter to my parents. I apologized for the scene at the airport and for the 2 years of havoc I had caused. In fact, I apologized for everything I could think of that might have distressed them, and finished by saying, "But now it's all over, so I hope we can all move on." I got a nice letter back from my father saying, "Thank you for your letter. I'm glad to hear it's all over." I also wrote to Fleur. The gist of my letter to her was we both knew it was coming to this. You saw the scene at the airport. I've already caused a lot of hurt, and I don't want to cause any more. God bless you. Goodbye. Fleur attended the same school as my 2 sisters. Ellen was only 6 years old at the time and was pretty much an appendage to Betty, always holding on to her skirt as if she were attached. Soon after I sent my letter to Fleur, she met Betty at school and told her that she had received a letter from me. Ellen overheard this conversation, and that evening she asked my parents, "Did you get a letter from Maxie?" "No," they replied. "Oh," she said, "because Fleur got one." My father was devastated all over again. He wrote to me immediately telling me I had always been untrustworthy and that my word meant nothing, that he never ever wanted to see or hear from me again, and that I shouldn't try to contact anyone else in the family, and that I should change my name so I wouldn't disgrace them any longer. So there I was, 18 years old, inexperienced, having just arrived in a new world, and having to deal with, "You are a disgrace. Don't ever contact us again, and change your name." Even my brother Alex, for the first time in his life, decided to get involved, and he wrote me a zinger too. His message was, "When are you going to stop being the destruction of this family, and how much more pain do you want to cause? I am worried that Daddy may try to kill himself." I kept writing to my father, but he wouldn't open my letters. He stopped eating, he lost weight, and wouldn't shave. He wouldn't even go to the store. He just checked out. Weeks went by. I kept writing, and he kept refusing to open my letters. After about 3 months of this, one of my dad's friends, Joe Kreindler, visited Montreal, and he came to see me. He was very polite, but he was also very firm with me. "Max," he asked, "what are you doing? You are destroying your family. At this rate, your father is going to die." So I told him my story. I told him that I had done the proper thing. I had to write that letter to Fleur. It was a goodbye letter. I also told him that I had had no contact with her since and that there wouldn't be any further contact because the relationship was over, finished. Mr. Kreindler went back to Barbados and somehow managed to get my father's ear. A short while later, my father came to Montreal to see me to patch things up. It was a very special visit. We were both hurting and needed to put the entire episode behind us. His visit was especially memorable because for me it was a clear acknowledgement that I was important to him, and I saw it as a sign of affection and love. I certainly needed some of both at the time. And so the Fellini movie ended.